Quarterback and tight end prospect talk here on RotoViz Overtime today. Last year, the players that we were most excited about at these positions were one Brock Bowers, who is already inducted into the Hall of Fame. And then we have Jaden Daniels, who is well on his way to getting that gold jacket. So today we have Matt Hicks. We're going to talk through the quarterbacks. We're going to talk through the tight ends and a nice, I'm going to say, nice, sharp, information-filled show. But sometimes we can talk longer then, and we can see how long it takes. But the rookie big board at the FF_educator is where you can find all the stuff from Matt. We will finish up today by letting him talk a little bit more about it. But Shawn, the quarterback class is intriguing. We'll see now how intriguing Matt thinks it is. Take it away.
Yeah, I kind of like this group. One of the things, some people who read my recent article are going to think I misunderstood what I was talking about, in that it's going to look like one QB rankings. But we've had so much success pushing QBs down if they're not Jaden Daniels, right? I mean, these guys are obviously not Jaden Daniels, both in terms of talent and also stylistically. But I think this class is fun. I also think that it's more of a 4-player class than, say, 1 or 2. So I'm going to ask Matt about them all together. Depending on different terminology that different people like to use, you can go different directions on this. But in terms of thinking about it from a Matthew Stafford, Brett Favre type of context, we're looking at Ward, Sanders, Dart, Milroe. How do these guys compare in pure arm talent?
Yeah, arm talent, the talent being the key word there. For me, it's Cam Ward. A drop-off, a pretty significant drop-off. In terms of arm talent, I would go Jaxson, Dart, and then somewhere, Jalen, Milroe, Shedeur, Sanders. In terms of the ability, so when I say arm talent, right, I'm thinking of strength and ability to adjust velocity, ability to adjust, your arm angles to get it through those windows. I know that is a term that a lot of folks use in a lot of different ways. Ward has the big arm, and he's got an excellent arm. I mean, he's pushing it 45, 50 yards downfield without sacrificing mechanics. He can get it 30 yards downfield on the run without really sacrificing accuracy. And so for me, he stands out in terms of that pure, strength, but also the ability to adjust velocity. And he does that well. Dart, to me, he's got that ability to adjust velocity down. He's got good velocity through the first and second levels of the field. He can push the ball downfield. I do think that he improvises his arm angles very well, and he's able to find those tight windows, that exciting way that we see quarterbacks winning nowadays. Jalen Milroe has a rocket, man. Like he has a huge arm, but he does not understand the idea of touch. And I know he tries, but he is not there, man. He really could have benefited from another year of college, if for no other reason.
Sounds like me trying to play golf, just like maximum power every shot.
Yeah, exactly. He's your buddy who shanks it into the lake, right? Because he's just ripping it
he's
back.
me who shanks it into the rough.
That is an absolutely perfect comparison there with Jalen Milroe. But he's strong. It's your buddy that bench presses. And with Shedeur Sanders, he has much better touch on his ball. And I will give him credit for his ability to adjust velocity, especially thinking about the short field. But he has really capped arm strength. I mean, it's an effort for him to get it past 30 yards downfield. And, we have seen that can win in the NFL, right? Like Brock Purdy is a successful NFL quarterback, but it does cap your fantasy potential specifically.
It's also a very specific scenario for Purdy, with the environment he's in and with the coach that he's got. Like if you don't land with somebody like a Kyle Shanahan, that's a major problem.
There's one of them, and he's already got a quarterback, right?
So this then, you could argue is separate, or you could argue is a sub area there under arm talent. I was sort of laughing at the end of the previous show because I was looking at the show sheet, and this is supposed to say, how do they compare in accuracy? But at some point we lost the space. And so it just says inaccuracy. And so I'm thinking, Richardson, Will Levis, some of those guys. We do have obviously a QB here that you just mentioned in terms of inaccuracy. The accuracy element is the portion that Sanders gains some of that ground back. But in order to make an NFL offense work, you're going to have to sustain drives. That has become especially true as explosive plays have been taken away. Who's going to be able to sustain drives at the NFL level and have the accuracy you need to kind of reach that minimum level where they can be, hopefully a 15-year starter, but at the very least, say a several-year starter?
Yeah, I thought the show sheet might have been a little bit of a Freudian slip because I think we have varying degrees of inaccuracy with all of these guys, and it is a limitation. And I think it's one of the reasons that we struggle with this quarterback class in general. Cam Ward, I mentioned I really like his arm talent. He can struggle with timing. He absolutely can struggle with timing, especially as you get into the deep field. He has a tendency to lead his receivers too far in the deep field, and he has a tendency to throw behind his receivers in the short field. That you can give some context to in the idea that his first 2 years at the FCS level at Incarnate Word, and then his first 2 years at Washington State, he was playing a lot of what I would call huck it, chuck it football, right? Which is just kind of take the snap, improvise, get that ball downfield, be athletic. And then he had to transition to Miami's pro style offense, which was very different. And I think in terms of pocket presence, mechanics, he did an awesome job. Decision-making, he did an awesome job translating, but I think the timing was the one thing lacking. And so I think that's what's holding us back on Cam Ward from loving him the way that we've loved some of the consensus quarterback ones the past couple of years. Shedeur Sanders, I really struggle with this one, guys, because I hear all the time, Shedeur Sanders, he's the accuracy quarterback. He's your choice if you want a safe, accurate quarterback. I don't think he's all that accurate. Now, when you give him a perfect pocket, no pressure, and his receiver is open in space, I think he's super accurate, right? There's not going to be a lot of situations he's going to walk into where an NFL team is going to allow him to have that opportunity the majority of his NFL snaps. If you look at Shedeur Sanders under pressure, consistently throws behind his receivers. You look at him in terms of deep field accuracy, consistently underthrows his receivers. I have a working theory that is a hot take, but I think that if Travis Hunter didn't have Shedeur Sanders, we might not think he's as great of a contested catch guy because Sanders just gave him so many opportunities to make highlight reel plays, just kind of tossing up those lob balls. So I'm not saying that Sanders is wholly inaccurate, but he's not this locked in accurate quarterback that sometimes we make him out to be. Jaxson Dart is another guy who he can execute on the first read. If his first read is there, he's hitting his guy. He's going to hit him in stride. He's got the timing down. He knows where to put the ball. He knows how to execute Lane Kiffin's offense. Where the big hesitation with Jaxson Dart is, what happens when you pull him out of that offense, which does not have similar concepts to pretty much any NFL offense. So he's going to have to learn a brand new offense. And we see when Jaxson Dart works off script, his accuracy does drop off. And so that's the concern specifically with his translation. Jalen Milroe, not accurate. I mean, he's just not accurate. I don't know. I don't feel like I really need to get it. He misses guys high. He misses them low. He'll throw behind them. He'll throw in front of them. At times, he makes perfect passes through tight windows, but it's not consistent. And to win at the NFL level, you have to be consistent.
So on Sanders, I mean, this isn't trying to overly bash him. Obviously, we'd love for him to succeed. Just looking at the results, however, we barely have him even in the second round of super flex drafts because it does seem like there's still such a high bust potential, and then the upside isn't there. Where in a super flex draft, especially depending on your scoring settings, you might simply prefer to have a running back or wide receiver in the super flex anyway. How concerned would you be, or how much does it factor? One of the things with him is that SIS, for example, has very good accuracy numbers, like a lot of the things that you're talking about, but the sack numbers are incredibly high. Now, in a lot of these situations, you're supposed to, well, the idea of the charting is that it takes out some of the plays when other quarterbacks are doing throwaways and what have you. So throwaways wouldn't necessarily be counted against them. But I mean, is Sanders benefiting from simply not throwing in situations where you really have to throw it? You can't take that sack. And then, maybe speak just for a second to the surroundings, because my understanding is that the offensive line, very weak, but you have Travis Hunter. And then even though these guys are probably not NFL guys, you have 3 additional pretty high level receivers. If you have 4 guys at the college level, you ought to be able to find somebody. Is that an accurate way of looking at it?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up that point. He takes a ton of sacks, and he takes bad sacks, like 10, 15-yard absolute drive killers. And you're right, it does boost his numbers. And again, we're not trying to just rail on Shedeur Sanders, but there was a clear campaign from the Sanders camp, because we'll include the coaching staff in this as well. There was a clear push to make him a Heisman candidate. You look at the amount he threw the ball. Everybody says, oh, Colorado, they were lied on Sanders because they never ran the ball. Guys, they didn't run the ball because they didn't bring in running backs, because Deion was looking to get Shedeur a Heisman trophy. I mean, we just have to be honest about this. And, I'm not knocking him, man. If I had the resources, maybe I would do what Deion's doing. You know what I mean? But I just think that's being realistic about it. And so there are plenty of cases there where he takes sacks, and that's really dropping or increasing his accuracy number, when a good decision would be just throwing the ball away, right? And I'm glad you mentioned the receivers as well, because those receivers were really strong. Past just Travis Hunter, Jonte Weister, I liked his tape a ton. And so Weister, for me, if I'm playing in like a 5-round rookie draft in a 16-team league, I'm finding a way, even just a free agent ad, because I do think Weister gets drafted maybe as a special teams guy because he came in small. But, him especially, he was really good. And you have enough of an offensive line. I know it wasn't the best offensive line in the country, but you're playing in the Big 12, man. You're not playing against good edge defenders. I'm sorry. Guys, name me a good edge defender out of the Big 12, right? Like, Shedeur Sanders is not playing against the top-level defense. He doesn't have the best offensive line. He doesn't have the worst offensive line either in that conference. So it's a bit of an excuse, but it's not that much of an excuse.
What types of offenses are you going to be able to design around these 4 guys, given the strengths and weaknesses we just talked about?
Yeah, so I think, if we just kind of build off Sanders a little bit, you mentioned it. I think like a West Coast concepts is the best case scenario for Sanders. With Cam Ward, I thought he executed a pro style offense very well. And so I think you could have a really balanced offense there. Let's say he ends up in Tennessee. I think it's actually a pretty good fit for him. Now, obviously, we need to add another wide receiver to really help him out. But just in terms of having a balanced run game, I think Ward has the ability to work within that. I know there's also a lot of talk about Ward ending up with the Giants. I think that's a perfectly fine landing spot for him, because the Giants' offensive line is terrible, right? We know that. That's normally a big red flag for a quarterback. But I mentioned it. Ward spent his first 4 seasons of college playing out of script behind a tough offensive lines. And so he's proven the ability to win off script and to be able to handle that pressure. And so if anybody is going to get the Giants as a landing spot, I think Ward's got the best shot of succeeding within that. Jaxson Dart, I mean, he's a full reset, so in terms of what scheme works best for him, I think you could say, an RPO concept scheme would be the best if you're thinking about like what Mike McDaniels is doing, right? You could look at that and say that's the closest to what Lane Kiffin's doing. But again, he didn't really, Dart didn't progress well through his reads. So maybe that's actually not even accurate. That's probably not good. I don't know. You got to start over with Jaxson Dart. You really do. And Jalen Milroe, I mean, you want to put him in an offense where he can use his legs. And I really hate to diminish a quarterback like that, but he needs time to develop as a passer. And so in the meantime, I think you need to be able to have a system where he can really kind of lean into that athletic ability.
So with Milroe, that was kind of leading on to the next question. What in terms of fantasy upside through their rushing capabilities with this group of 4 quarterbacks? Is Milroe the one that you'd be looking at that could, get you fantasy scoring from the Russian aspect? And then what's the positives or limitations on the rest of the group?
Yeah, I will say with Ward, Sanders, and Dart, there's a good enough floor of rushing ability where they can be impactful for fantasy purposes. Milroe, in terms of being an explosive athlete, that is carrying his fantasy value, right? Because that's really juicy upside, and we shouldn't ignore that. And because you can even look at, I just finished, we put out projections at the Rookie Big Board. So every NFL offense. And, I put in the Anthony Richardson projection and it was absolutely terrible. But because he's got the rushing floor, he was still quarterback 14 and the projections are quarterback 16, right? I think I had him at 55% completion rate. It didn't matter. And so there's an opportunity for Jalen Milroe to win on the ground in a similar way to a guy like Anthony Richardson or Kyler Murray, just in terms of elusiveness, in terms of scramble ability. And when they do break open, it's a 10-yard play and then execute in the red zone on those touchdowns, right? So Milroe definitely would have the highest upside. I think Jaxson Dart in general is a little bit of an underrated athlete. Like, he can scramble very well. He's fairly smart about when to slide, when to pick up yards. And he's got some good burst to him. So I'm not suggesting he's going to be, a 1,000-yard rusher or anything like that. But, in terms of, maybe he gets 6 rushing yards a season because he gets calls in the red zone. That's something that Jaxson Dart could do once he gets to the point where he's a starting NFL running back or quarterback. Sorry.
And then with the 4 that we've mentioned so far, if we look back to, 2020, 4, it has turned out to be, through the NFL draft, quite successful. There was 6 quarterbacks taken in the top 12 picks, 5 in the top 10. So very quarterback heavy. But even like Williams had his negatives going at the first pick. But we look down through even the positives, so we have to still look at what he could do moving forward. But overall, the class looks to be really strong for 2024. McCarthy obviously missed the entire season. But then when we look to this year, how are you ranking these guys for reality? Where do you expect them to go? And if you're looking at last year's class, are any of these, breaking into even those top 12 picks, so Bo Nix going to the Broncos at 12, is there any of these guys that could be pushing into that range in terms of where you would have them ranked in comparison?
Yeah, so in terms of where I had the 2024 class ranked immediately after the NFL draft compared to where I have the guys ranked this year, we would be looking at, in order, Caleb, Jaden Daniels was my quarterback too. And then I had JJ McCarthy and then Drake May, and Cam Ward would be right there with Drake May. I think that's a really good comparison point for if you're thinking about, what's Cam Ward versus Drake May. And I think if it wasn't a loaded quarterback class last year and you drafted Drake May at 103, I think you'd be fairly confident in that pick heading into this year, right? So I think that's a pretty good value point. Past that, it would have been Bo Nix from last year's group, and then a huge drop off. And then it would have been Penix based on draft capital, then Shedeur Sanders, then I have Jaxson Dart, then I have Jalen Milroe. So, and I'm still not excited about Penix. So I think anything after Bo Nix, you could consider for me being generally skeptical about how they're going to contribute to a fantasy football roster.
And then in the draft itself, do you expect him in the first round and then the rest of the guys beyond that, or how are you going in terms of draft capital?
Yeah, in terms of NFL draft capital, I expect Ward to be probably the top pick at this point in time. I think whether it's the Titans or the Giants straight up, I think, for me, I do my draft capital in certain buckets, and my top bucket is pick 1 through 10, and Cam Ward's there. Shedeur Sanders, for me, he's in the 11 to 20 overall bucket for me. And that's just trying to read the NFL tea leaves. I still wouldn't be shocked if he's not a first round pick, or he gets like, I think maybe the best comparison is that like Aaron Rodgers slide. Remember, what did he slide to, like late teens or 20s, or the Ben Roethlisberger slide? Maybe that's what Shedeur Sanders is going to experience.
Yeah, once you get through that group of teams that potentially needs a quarterback, it can be you're kind of almost waiting for somebody to trade up at that point.
Exactly, right. And so that's kind of where I see Shedeur Sanders. There are some folks who still think he's a top 10 pick. I'm just not there on him. Jaxson Dart is the guy who I believe could sneak into the top 50. I don't think he's a day 1 pick, but I could see there's a lot of teams who could pass on quarterback in the first round who would have those picks in the second round. The Giants if they pass, the Browns if they pass. I know the Raiders have a short-term solution, but I think Geno Smith to Jaxson Dart would actually make a ton of sense. So maybe the Raiders are looking at that as kind of a succession plan. And then I think Jalen Milroe is a day 2 late guy. I don't think he's going top 50.
And then is there anything beyond those 4 quarterbacks that we should be looking at? Is there anyone that you see an NFL future for?
A quick shout out to, this isn't my sleeper guy, but Dillon Gabriel has some of the best tape. He's the best pure passer in this class. He's 5'11", 205. That's going to limit him. He's not going to be drafted as a starting quarterback. He's going to be a day 3 pick, but I'm just throwing it out there to say, don't be shocked if Dillon Gabriel is a really solid, quarterback 2 for fantasy, high-end quarterback 3 for fantasy at some point in the future. The guy who I'm actually really excited about is Tyler Shough out of Louisville. So that's my sleeper for this year. He's 6'5", 219. So he's got that prototypical NFL size. He's got great pocket presence. He's got a huge arm. He is very accurate. He's more accurate than any quarterback we've talked about here today, especially over the middle of the field. And when quarterbacks are accurate over the middle of the field, that's a really nice indicator for me. And I'm not claiming, guys, that he's the most mobile. He's certainly not the type of athlete with, Dart or Sanders or Milroe, who we've talked about. But for a guy who's 6'5", 220, he moves the pocket really well, and he is mobile and athletic. I think he's a day 2 draft pick. There's not a lot of folks saying that, so I could sound really silly when it comes to draft weekend and he goes round 6 or something. But I think he's a day 2 pick. And the big reason that folks are holding back on Shough, he's got limited production because he had 3 season-ending injuries in college. All right, but which normally I would not ignore. If there were 3 knee injuries or 3 rotator cuff injuries, I'd be really worried about that. He had broken collarbone, broken fibula. Those are not soft tissue injuries. They're not muscle injuries. Those are things that fully recover and don't suggest long-term, risk. And so Tyler Shough, for me, that's the sleeper guy that I'm really locking in on pre-draft.
We're going to move to the tight ends. I have some more questions about Gabriel, but I think that we'll leave those for another day. The tight ends. This is a pretty fun group. I'm going to propose to you that the top tier is actually 3 players. They're 3 very different players. You have mega production from Tyler Warren, but at an advanced experience level. You get mega production from Fannin, but obviously at the small school level. And then you have really very impressive adjusted production for Loveland, and he's young. But there also seems to me like there maybe are some red flags from him that are not reflected in, as far as I can tell, he may even go in the top 10 picks in the NFL draft. Is this a 3-player group, or who should we very clearly be chucking out? And it's, these are the superstars instead.
Yeah, for me, it's not. The top tier really is Tyler Warren, and he is a clean tier break for me from Colston Loveland. But I do think it's worth starting here with Harold Fannin. And I understand, because when I watch Harold Fannin tape, I got excited as well. And you can see he's got good tape against Texas A&M. There's good examples of him winning against Power 4 competition. For me, 6'3", 238 is what he came in at. I think he was probably bulked up a little bit. So I think he probably is truly closer to 6'3", 230. Where I really struggle with Harold Fannin, I don't see him fitting cleanly in an NFL offense. And for me, it's a dreaded word, guys. I think he's going to be more of an H-back. It really just seems like his skill set better fits an H-back than the type of tight end who can consistently get even 5 or 6 receptions in a game. And so that's where I'm really holding back on Fannin. The draft capital will tell us a lot. I think if he's drafted day 2, then you have to make the argument that you're not drafting an H-back type role in day 2, right? But if he's drafted day 3, I think that does. And of course, the context of the team, we have to play that in as well.
The Packers would tell you that you can take Josiah DeGuara anywhere that you want in the draft. When you're on the clock, you can take him.
I'm glad you said it, because Josiah DeGuara is exactly the guy that I mentioned when I talk about Harold Fannin. So
with Fannin there, so you just articulated my deepest, darkest fear. You think that is not necessarily more likely, but is a real risk as opposed to being a Jordan Reed or an Evan Ingram?
Yeah, I do. I think it's more likely. And it's partially it's because that Harold Fannin is good at the things you want an H-back to do. There are examples of Matt Bowling Green clearing lanes well. He is physical and willing to engage in that tackling side of things, where if you look at an Evan Ingram, right, he was never a good blocker. He was never willing to get physical, and he was only a pass catcher. I also think with Fannin, he had a good combine, But in terms of athleticism, you really wanted to see him crush the combine. And for me, he needed to crush it to be a day 2 pick. And, I don't think he did that and made an argument for his profile in the way that a guy like Reed or Ingram did. Again, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here with Fannin. I like him too, but I can't talk myself into it.
When we look at tight end, then this is more like a general question, but looking at this class and previous classes, we've seen obviously elite talent coming at the position, the likes of Bowers, the likes of Sam Laporta. Trey McBride took a couple of years to break out, but is absolutely dominant now. Is there anything changing in the college game that's leading to them being obviously the elite producers that they have been, but also being ready to do it immediately in the NFL? And is there a chance that we continue to see a trend of, fantasy relevant year 1 tight ends who then, breaking out in year 1 as a tight end in the NFL leads to very positive long-term, success? Are we seeing something change in college that's leading to that ability?
I think that there's an argument to be said in the way that high school players in general are being developed. They're being developed as more well-rounded athletes. So you'll see, 10, 15 years ago, if you were a really good high school football player, right, you would just be a high school football player, and you'd be probably primarily focused on that weight building and conditioning around football specifically year round.
Is this going to lead to somehow that Antonio Gates played basketball? No,
it's the Antonio Gates effect. I think that's a perfect way of saying it, right? And now it's not weird. It's not weird that he played basketball, right? Yeah. Like the Brock Bowers of the world, the Tyler Warrens of the world, they're playing baseball. I believe Tyler Warren was a really good baseball prospect as well. They're playing basketball. But I would argue that this phenomena, if we want to call it, of tight ends producing earlier in the NFL, I'd argue that it has more to do with the NFL and the way that they've identified a gap in defenses than necessarily the players coming out. I think they've understood that ability to mismatch the slot over the middle of the field, and just in general deploying the tight end as a receiver instead of just leaving another guy in to block. How valuable that is in offense and how much that helps you create space and spread out the field. Because even if you look at a guy like Sam Laporta, right, he's a good athlete, but he's not like Brock Bowers, right? And so part of it is just leaning into what they can.
Nobody like Brock Bowers.
There's nobody like Brock Bowers.
He's played one season in the NFL and he's already in the Hall of Fame.
How impressive, right? Yeah. But we called it first, so we're also in the Hall of Fame.
Matt, one of the things that I talk about a lot with, especially Dynasty, but you can use it in some other formats as well, is that if you target these elite tight ends, and they do go at different prices, but obviously they often go in the second round where, you're getting the best guy at a position as opposed to getting the 6th, 7th, 8th best guy, maybe at running back, wide receiver. So our Dynasty rosters tend to be very dominant at that position, which especially if you're playing tight end premium, it's a big difference maker. Is that the right play this season? Or one of the things here with the depth, is this a class? Sometimes you worry that just because you're focusing on a current class, that the players and their profiles loom a little larger in your head than they would at a different time of the season. You do this stuff, as you mentioned, year round. So you've got very good benchmarks for how the depth of the class compares to the depth of other classes. Long way to get around to the question of Terrance Ferguson, Elijah Arroyo, Mason Taylor, Gunnar Helm. Are any of these guys going to be the players you want instead? I never really looked to getting that, second or third tier tight end because it tends to be a throwaway of a 4th round rookie pick, even though you can say those are mostly throwaway picks anyway. Is this different? Do we have a guy from this group who is actually going to be an impact player and maybe pretty quickly?
Yeah, I like Mason Taylor. I think one thing that's encouraging about Mason Taylor is if you look at the LSU offense, it really ran through him last year. Great pass catcher. And so I'm not comparing him 1-to-1, but if you're saying like, if you want somebody who's a little bit more of a mold of a Jordan Reed, like we were talking about earlier, a similar style is Mason Taylor. Elijah Arroyo, like that's your guy who, if you're just like into the athlete, like he has got excellent athleticism, low production, but hyper efficient production. So when he gets targets, he does a lot with it. But I'm glad you mentioned Terrance Ferguson too, because that's my 4th round sleeper tight end. So he's a really good mover. He's fluid. He wins before the catch. He wins after the catch. He's got really good hands as well. And so he's somebody who I think could end up on day 2 even. But I will say in general with this class, I want to pay up for Tyler Warren early in the draft instead of having to wait, instead of having to use maybe a late 2nd or early 3rd on Mason Taylor. I don't want to use my early 2nd on Colston Loveland, right? And so, one of the biggest questions I've gotten in terms of 1st round draft strategy in the Rookie Big Board Discord over the last month or so is how early is too early for Tyler Warren? And especially if you have a premium on him, like 104 is not too early for me in a Superflex format. I'm willing to go and pay up because, as you mentioned, if he hits, he hits. There's no young tight end that only hits a little bit in Dynasty, right? Their value skyrockets.
And then as we look to wrap out the tight ends, is there any other guys you want to highlight that we haven't talked about today? And with the testing and so on, is there any of maybe some of the freak athletic testing that sneaks in there?
Honestly, I think we've discussed who needs to be discussed. I think some folks, and I will say the one other guy who we didn't get into, but his name was mentioned is Gunnar Helm. I do like Gunnar Helm. My only thing with him is I think he's such a good blocker. I understand why they wouldn't want to use him as a pass catcher. And his combine was pretty disappointing. I know we saw he had the picture of the bruised ankle that came out afterwards. So maybe put a little bit more stock in his pro day testing than you normally would. But Gunnar Helm, to me, I think he's going to be the guy. Who's the guy on Detroit? Brock Wright, who just like steals the red zone touchdowns because Gunnar Helm was such a good red zone guy. Or I think that my worry with Gunnar Helm is that that's his role in the NFL, is that he's just the guy we all get mad at because he stole the touchdown from the tight end we wanted to get it.
Yeah, when you see a tight end, grabbing the ball at the back of the end zone, and you're like, "Yes, Sam Laporte a touchdown." You're like, "Nope."
No, that was the wrong 80-something. Oh,
yeah. I think it's just we'll leave it there because I'm just going to start tilting here. We're starting into, but
now,
that
we'll
is
cut this out if
yeah.
you are not interested in it. But you very quickly dismissed the guys who tested sort of off the charts. And one of the things that you noted at the beginning with Fannin is that he needed to destroy the combine. I was wondering if you had done if it's part of your process at all to kind of cross-check the Senior Bowl tracking versus the combine results. Because one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that you have all of these tight ends who performed really well at the combine, but you look at the Senior Bowl tracking and they came in not just behind Fannin, but like not even in the same world.
Mm-hmm.
You have Donovan Edwards at running back. And I mean, I've got him on a lot of W teams. So I would love if somehow the combine reflected anything, but it's sort of hilarious because obviously his peripherals, I mean, it's just production itself. And then the peripherals are astonishingly bad. His combine was fantastic, but he's somebody else where the Senior Bowl tracking, it looks like it's somebody that they like had a tracker on the water boy or something. Like, how do you go out and practice at the Senior Bowl and track so poorly if you're that level of athlete? Are we seeing something in the Senior Bowl tracking that's basically like easily separating out for us the athletes versus the football players?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have an answer for that. But that's like churning a lot of gears in my head here. In terms of like who gets selected for the Senior Bowl, right? And what, because like the thing about the Senior Bowl that I'm trying to think through process wise is those are the guys, the Senior Bowl are inviting the guys who NFL teams want to see more of. And so, especially when you look at these tight ends, right, is, like, who was it? CJ Dippre got invited, is like, what makes, or Thomas Fadone got that late, Jackson Hawes, what makes those guys stand out to NFL teams compared to what they could see at the combine? And is it this idea of we'll see the athleticism in Indianapolis, but we're going to get something else from them at the Senior Bowl? Yeah. I don't have a good answer for that, unfortunately. It's a good question, though.
And that is where we are going to close out this episode where we talk quarterbacks and tight ends. We did talk about the running back position and the wide receiver position in 2 separate shows. Lots of great information from Matt. I know stuff we talked about on these episodes. You can find him discussing and sharing much more about it over on the Rookie Big Board and on the YouTube side of things. But Matt, one final time, let the listeners know what you've got going on.
Yeah, man. Listen, hey, if you've listened to 3 episodes of me talking about rookies, I imagine you want more. So I'd encourage you, just head on over to patreon.com/rookiebigboard. Like I said, we're doing this 365 days a year, and especially with rookie draft season coming up, personalized advice for your rosters. We're doing one-on-one draft strategy, Zoom calls as well. So just lots of good stuff, customizable, help you win your rookie drafts.
Awesome stuff. Thanks again, Matt, for coming on. I know we've run longer than we tend to do, but it's been an awesome conversation covering a lot of the prospects for the listeners here at RotoViz Overtime. So we do greatly appreciate that. We'll have to run it back in 2026. We'll get your slot booked in. Shawn, any final words as we close it out here?
No, just check Matt out. These shows are always fantastic. This was exactly what I was hoping to get today. We got the whole thing at once. We hope you've enjoyed all 3 shows. We love you guys.
Shawn linking it into the Stealing Bananas outro there. He almost signed us off for this one, but it is RotoViz OT. So until we are back, have a good one.